3 jobs in a year. It was kind of my uncle and aunt to keep me, and I got on quite well with my aunt. I would do my best to help her wash the dishes after meals, but I was so inept at this, often breaking her best crockery, that after some time she refused my help and told me to stick to writing stories. My uncle usually had his head stuck in the radio, keeping up with the latest political news. He was very conservative, never forgave the British Prime Minister Attlee for bringing an end to the British rule in India. His eldest son John had strong views about everything under the sun and would never admit to being wrong about anything. So I avoided getting into arguments with him. His younger brother, about my age, had no opinions at all, a morose, silent fellow. The youngest, Alan, was the friendliest. As he was too young to have grown up in India, he did not have the colonial mindset of the rest of the family. After the family dinner, I would usually go up to my attic room and do some writing. Going through my diaries, the one I'd kept in school exercise books during my last year in India. I thought they might make for a memoir if I put them together after some editing and rewriting. I was good at writing set pieces, the Holi festival, the break of the monsoon, crossing the Ganga, and if I developed some of the characters in my journal, friends, neighbors, shopkeepers, etc., I might be able to blend all that material into a readable book, something between a novel, a journal, a memoir, and a travelogue. Till then, I had only written a few short stories published in India. Now I wanted to spread my wings and write a book. I was not sure what kind of book, but there was no harm in starting one. My friends, Somi, Ranbir, and Kishan, and their families leapt out at me from the pages of my diaries, demanding that I do them justice and bring them to life on a written page. And so my uncle and aunt did not see much of me except on Sundays. At lesser reaches, even Saturdays were working days. Letters from my friends in Dehra were a great consolation to me. I longed to be with them again, and whenever I returned from work, I would see if there were any letters for me. An Indian postage stamp on an envelope always gave me a thrill, and I would hurry up to my room to find out what my friends were doing and to read their encouraging messages. "You will be a big writer one day," wrote Bhim, and "come back when you are famous," wrote Kishan. I promised to do so. I couldn't return a failure. After 3 months with Los Riches, I found another job. The London office of Thomas Cook, the travel agents, had sent one of their representatives over to Jersey to make bookings for the summer tourist rush. Her name was Mrs. Manning. She had opened a one-room office in St. Helier and she needed an assistant. Some kind soul had recommended me for the job, and I was glad to take it. She paid slightly better than what I had been getting at Los Riches, and the working hours were definitely more civilized. Mrs. Manning was in her early 30s and, as far as I knew, separated. She had a business-like manner and she was always well turned out. But she smoked heavily. In fact, she was a chain smoker and the office was usually thick with cigarette smoke. I had never smoked in my life and I had no desire to do so, but I had always been thrown into the company of heavy smokers. My mother, my stepfather, my school teacher, Mr. Jones with his cigars, and now my employer. There was no escape. My job was to take phone calls from the London office, make hotel bookings as required, and tend to any paperwork that Mrs. Manning passed on to me. She was out a good deal, leaving me in charge of the Thomas Cook business. Being inexperienced, I made the occasional blunder, confusing twin beds with double beds, with the result that people who wanted to sleep together were being kept apart, and the couples who preferred to sleep in separate beds were being bundled into the same bed. Still, I was getting used to the vagaries and preferences of human nature when Mrs. Manning decided to have a love affair. She took up with a rather raffish gentleman who sold second-hand fire extinguishers. It was quite a scam. He would buy up old fire extinguishers, give them a coat of paint, emboss them with a fictional trademark, and sell them as new. It seemed a rather risky way of making a living, but he appeared to be doing quite well at it, and he was always bursting with confidence. Of course, it's a racket, he told me on one of his visits to the office. But it's better than sitting in an office all day. Come along and help me with one of my demonstrations. I declined the honor, but Mrs. Manning may have accompanied him on some of his excursions. He boasted that he would cover every home on the island within a month. Well, it was a small island, and he must have unloaded a lot of the out-of-date fire extinguishers on unsuspecting residents. As Mrs. Manning was seldom in the office, the London office got worried and sent someone over to check on our operations. He found me at my desk, working on my novel, there being nothing else to do between phone calls, while Mrs. Manning's desk was taken up by a couple of freshly painted fire extinguishers. "What are these for?" asked the man from Thomas Cook. "They put out fires, sir." "I don't see any fires in this building." "They belong to one of our travelers," I said truthfully. That did not help, and Mrs. Manning was fired, the office was closed down, and I was out of a job. Later, I heard Mrs. Manning and her lover had moved on to the next island, Guernsey, where they were doing brisk business, selling naughty French postcards. Before the debacle with Thomas Cook, I had on an impulse sat for the Jersey Civil Service exam, open to anyone who had completed their schooling. There were only about 200 candidates, and when the results were published in Jersey Evening Post, I found that I had stood fourth in the island with a special recommendation for my knowledge of English literature, one of the 4 subjects. My uncle was duly impressed. It meant a job in the civil service, at least a junior one. The salary was better than any I had had so far, and my 18th birthday was celebrated with a bottle of champagne and a kofta curry and pilaf, specially prepared by my aunt. It made me even more homesick for India and my friends.